'Cause like a winter tonight, I thought I would always have light. The quick flash that you gave to me, so dark I could barely see. Looking
From wherever you are around the world, welcome and thank you for joining us on today's special edition of Circle of Insight, Kelly's Causes. That's right, we're here with former Nip Tuck TV star and movie actress Kelly Carlson. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
We're going to be exploring the mind of a psychopath. Hang tight, folks. We're here with Dr. Kent Kiehl, professor of psychology and neuroscience at the University of New Mexico. Let's welcome him to the circle. Welcome, Dr. Kiehl.
Thank you very much for having me.
This is a fascinating topic, but before we get started, I want to make sure everybody knows about your book, The Psychopath Whisperer. Tell me a little bit why you got motivated to write that book.
I think there's been a number of really exciting developments that have happened in the field of psychopathy research in the last 5 or 10 years. And there really wasn't anybody else who had written a book, an academic that is, who had written a book to try to educate the public about this condition and about the science. And so I took it upon myself to try to craft a book that would be entertaining and fun, but is also educational in the sense that it helps to provide the best science to the popular audience. And there's also been just some really interesting developments in treatment and management of high-risk kids who are likely to potentially develop that label or diagnosis of psychopathy as an adult, and that has really shown that they can be effectively managed, or at least reduce their chances that they're going to be antisocial. And so those were the main motivations for writing the book.
Nice.
Well, Kelly, I know you have a slew of questions for Dr. Kiehl. I'll let you go after him.
I sure do. To start with, Dr. Kiehl, do you differentiate sociopathy and psychopathy? Or because I know there are some that say they're the same and some say they're different.
Yes. Generally, the symptoms of both of those two terms or diagnosis are the same. So they're trying to capture the same construct. It's just that the term sociopathy was coined in the behaviorist era of psychology, when you were believed to be a blank slate. Social forces made you what you are, whereas psychopathy is agnostic to etiology. So it could be social forces that cause the symptoms. It could be biological. But as we all know, it's really the interaction between those two. And so sociopathy isn't a term that's typically used in common scientific parlance anymore, but so psychopathy is really the term that's used everywhere. But they do generally mean the same thing. It's just the one term means they think that you are made that way. So for example, Dexter, the Dexter character, it's clear that the authors that created that character are trying to say that he was made that way from the experiences that he went through, and traumatic experiences as a child. And so that would be kind of an example. But really, in scientific language, we're only going to talk about psychopathy.
Interesting. Yeah, because people have that common question.
Yeah, that is a fascinating. Yeah, a lot of people do say sociopathy still, but I think it's more in the media, unfortunately.
Tell me if this is true or not, because what I understood about, I'm going to use sociopathy for a second, and psychopathy was sociopaths are generated or created by their environment. This is just what I've been educated on. And then psychopathy is more genetic, like born. And so it led me to the question, are people that are raised in gang environments, maybe even military, because you have to learn to compartmentalize, would be a form of a sociopath, but not necessarily dangerous to the core?
I think you've summarized the distinction, quite, accurately. But psychopathy does include, it's kind of agnostic to etiology. So It allows genetic explanations and social explanations to both fall from the term. It's really just terminology.
Got it.
Your question about, it's not uncommon for people to ask about just training or environment, or, when you go through someone who goes through SEER training or one of those very stressful environments, does that break somebody down and allow them to do things that they might otherwise do? Or does that create psychopathic symptoms? And certainly, any form of training like that can, make it easier for people to go do the things that they're being trained to do. Think about like a doctor who, starts out getting potentially nauseous when they try to think about doing an operation. and eventually, 5 years later is able to, eat dinner while they're doing surgery.
Right.
And so you get used to it.
Okay.
And I think the difference that for psychopathy or psychopathic traits, we're really, from a clinical perspective, assessing someone who has pathological levels. So someone that, after going through that training, they start to develop problems in maintaining relationships, maintaining jobs, maintaining stability. They start to act out if they get impulsive. And certainly some people might internalize the stresses of battlefield stress and other types of things, and then make them act out more. I mean, we see this quite commonly. And other people develop other symptoms and problems like post-traumatic stress and other types of things. But generally, if somebody enters into the military with a certain personality structure or basis, it's quite difficult to really change it to the point where it becomes pathological or something like that. It certainly is possible that if you have someone who scores high on these traits, that you could help them manifest them more readily. They might gravitate towards things that might allow them to do that. But the military is actually fairly sophisticated about, especially when it gets into special forces, is that psychopaths are terrible teammates.
Yes.
They don't behave.
That's right.
They don't participate in groups well. They're always off doing their own thing. And that gets quickly weeded out because they're so unreliable. And even more unreliable when they're not on station. I mean, when you leave them to their own devices and then you send them off to do something, they do a lot of crazy things. And there was a book by a Colonel Grossman who wrote a bit about this whole issue, and that they're very good, because what they want in those special forces trainings are guys that are very resilient, but do it only when they're told and are able to turn it on and off, and are able to come back from that. So, but certainly there always is the concern that such training and other things could contribute to someone acting badly, but whether or not it would truly be a psychopathic-like manifestation is, I think, there's not a lot of evidence for that yet.
Okay.
How about a hitman?
So I've met hitmen I interviewed them who were almost perfect scorers on psychopathy, so they met like all of the criterion. And then I have met ones that it was a job, and they literally, viewed it as almost like a wartime kind of thing. So they had a justification for it. They had that, and they didn't score high on psychopathy. I mean, you wouldn't want them to be your enemy by any means, but the point is that it wasn't necessarily pathological. They did it as more of a business. And although I'm kind of being a little callous in how I say that, snipers, like this big movie that just came out, individuals who commit those types of things because a government tells you to do so is kind of justified. And in this context, the person was committing those types of assassinations because their family had told them to do that, the family that they belonged to, the extended mafia family. And in that context, they felt justified doing that, just like the sniper does who does it for the government.
Sure.
And I think what's important to recognize is that the sniper or the hitman who is doing it for those types of forces is not necessarily going to have very, very, very high scores on psychopathy.
Right.
But I've met hitmen then again who've done that kind of thing, and they've been very high scores because they do it in such a way that they inflict additional violence. They might be sadistic. They enjoy it to a point, and so that's definitely someone who's good. And they have problems in all the other areas of their lives, like we talked about before. And so then that's somebody who is very dangerous, of course. Yeah.
Someone who enjoys the act of it versus being told what to do as a job. This person has more of an impulse.
Kind of the thing that makes it really dangerous is the psychopath is someone who have a lot of difficulty turning it off. And so they'll continue to do such things even when they've left such a employment, or for example, or whatever. I mean, really one of the things that mystifies people is that a lot of serial killing crimes, that so-called crimes that there's not that type of political or governmental motivation, and it mystifies people. Why would you go do something like that? Why would you kill people like that? There's no financial motive. There's no other type of motive. It even makes it more awkward to understand. And that's what we usually see the psychopath commit, is those types of crimes. Right. They really leave people like, why would they even do that? Like there's no motive. It's almost like it's almost mystifying.
Sorry, that brings me to one of my biggest questions is, I've had an experience with a psychopath. And when I'm trying to describe to other people the level of danger that can be present, I don't know how to describe to them that this person has an absolute indifference for what we consider important, which is feelings, emotions, your well-being. How do you describe to somebody to get them to wrap their head around and to understand that this person over here is completely indifferent to you?
Well,
That's tough.
That's a tough question.
It is tough, and I would say that you're really not alone because I can tell you that almost every victim of a psychopath, didn't anticipate being a victim, right? Or they wouldn't have been there,
Right.
or they would have left. And it's really is quite amazing, how many victim psychopaths can accumulate, and that's because on the initial first impression, they're very glib, they're very talkative, they're very jovial, they're entertaining. They do things that are exciting and novel and that other people wouldn't, and that can be very attractive in the short term. And then the short term, but in the long term, you end up finding out they haven't maintained stable jobs or relationships, and they've jumped from place to place, and they've got a lot of creditors after them and other types of things, and they don't pay good attention to their parents, or if they have children, they don't even know their birth dates, and so there's a lot of those types of red flags that I think are really kind of important to recognize. And perhaps I should read a book, like Are You Dating a Psychopath? And give some people some questions and things that they could ask. But there are certainly a lot of very simple ways of trying to help understand those things. But one of the symptoms of psychopathy, and if you're meeting someone who has even moderate levels of these traits, so I would educate, recommend people that they read about how to assess those symptoms and what are the signs and symptoms associated with psychopathy and what are the red flags. And then if you start to see some red flags, just take your time, before getting into moving in with them or something, which they would likely want to do very quickly. Okay, so
I think you hit a button there.
Could I help you write this book? No, I'm just kidding.
There you go.
But it is those types of things the symptoms that people just, don't anticipate. And it's because they're just so different. I mean, psychopaths are just so completely different. It really does take, and even I've been, victimized earlier by individuals who I would say really have high levels of these traits. And I'm like an expert in the condition, right? And it still sometimes surprises you. So I generally try to take time to cultivate relationships, take time to understand, collect as much background information about people before you bring them into your inner circle and start to engage them in business practices or something else. You really, really, really want to take your time to get to know them before you do those committed types of relationships that can then be extremely awkward and or dangerous to get out of with them.
Yeah.
Can I ask you a quick question of evolutionary adaptation? Is there anything there for these people? Do you see any kind of evolutionary adaptation for them to be behaving this way?
So that's a great question. There has been quite a lot of written about the evolutionary arguments about these types of traits. So for one thing, they're very resilient. And so trauma, bad things don't bother them. And so they don't get depressed, they don't get anxious, they don't get obsessive about things or worry. And so that can be in a harsh environment, that can be very adaptive to just not have those types of things affect you. Also, they're driven to migrate. Okay, so they have a biology that helps to it doesn't develop attachments, right? You don't develop attachments to any person, place, or thing, and so you move to one place to another. And in a genetic perspective, shifting, the genetic pool, so to speak, is sometimes valuable because you don't want to get inbreeding. So if you have a small proportion of your population that has something that drives them to go out and migrate and then try to start something new, the belief is that these traits kind of manifest in that kind of a context. That is, it is a mating strategy, if you will. And so there's actually some papers on this that psychopaths, they have a lot more children than others. They move very frequently. They're very engaging and exciting for a short term. So they meet with someone, they reproduce, and they leave. And then the woman, usually the family, the environment there is then required to help raise the child. And so there's models of this and that's one of the ways we think about psychopathy is that for a very small percentage of men, that's a very adaptive way of reproducing.
Mm-hmm.
It's not conscious by any means. I mean, most of them don't even, think about anything like this. But there have been some pretty interesting, academic arguments about that that have been published.
Kind of reminds me a little bit of a player.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that falls back into
Right.
your book of dating and psychopathy, but the player seems to have some kind of traits there. The guys that go out there, they go one girl from another.
Yeah, well, I mean, there is an age distribution too. So, you
Sure.
do see when you're younger, you're more likely to be exploring in your environment and sexuality and all of those things that we do when we're younger. And then, but psychopaths basically are like in a perpetual state like that. So they'll be 40 and they'll still be doing those same things. And again, what you really want to recognize is that they just don't develop long-term relationships. 3 months is long for them, right? And by the time they're 3 months, they've already started dating 2 or 3 other people.
Mm-hmm.
And they do the same thing at home, at work, at school, and family and friends. And so they just don't develop long-term, stable, relationships.
What about asexuality? I've read that a lot of times with psychopaths, you're not, they don't have a strong, and I'm just making this up, but like a sexual aura, like that you can read that you're feeling off of somebody. Is that correct?
Psychopaths are pretty promiscuous. Generally, they're very. In fact, that's one of the traits, is that promiscuity is kind of disproportionate to the environments in which they grew up. So you're talking about someone who's often had sex with thousands, hundreds if not thousands of individuals, and so that's a very common symptom, and it's just very indiscriminate.
That's what
actually.
I mean. I guess that's what I meant.
Yeah, so there's not a lot of stick-to-itness, if you will. They don't stick to any one relationship or any one person, and so they definitely have that's a very central characteristic.
How do they respond to being dumped?
So psychopaths are hot-headed, and they are what we refer to as very poor behavioral controls. That is, they're likely to be verbally aggressive. They're likely to end up even being physically aggressive. It's very common to see them in domestic violence-related issues. They have no concerns with hitting a woman versus hitting a man or anything like that. So they really don't have that inhibitory control or even sense of right or wrong about that. They just do what they want without any concern or really any insight into the consequences.
That's scary.
Yeah.
It is scary. Well, that's part of the lack of empathy and the callousness, the lack of remorse. Those things play into it, and so that they will abuse almost anything in their environment. And it's often something that obviously leads to huge problems, right? It can lead to a lot of different types of relationships problems, but they do it. I mean, most high scorers that we work with have been in fights with their teachers.
Mm-hmm.
Teachers.
I don't know any kid that hit a teacher. And then when I got into prisons and started working with these high scorers, these high-risk individuals, it was common for them to have decked a teacher when they were 7, 8, 9 in high school. And my point is that they're willing to use violence against someone in that realm, and then they are also willing to do it in the relationship realm. It's just equal. They just don't discriminate,
Hi, welcome to Adelante. This is Adelante Recovery, and my name is Yvette Kuglin, and I'm part of the staff.
Adelante Recovery Center has helped people in dual diagnosis for 5 years. We accept most PPO insurances and provide luxury accommodations and 24-hour support. To speak with an admissions counselor, call 1-888-242-4450.
A lot of time we don't even know what's wrong with us, and sometimes we need to get away to figure that out. So if you want to go for a little retreat out in Corona Del Mar, which is a confidential location, we're here to help. So we're only a phone call away. Thank you.
You had something about him, about scent.
Yeah, this is another thing. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not. I just read. When you are face to face with a psychopath, or maybe I'm not phrasing this correctly, when you're with somebody who has empathy, let's just say, and you're having a conversation, everything seems fine. Then you switch over to a psychopath. Everything looks fine, but you're detecting something off. I was told that it's like normal people, I guess, if that you can say that, kick out a hormone, and psychopaths do not. So your brain is detecting a lack of a hormone or something?
Scent or some sort.
Scent.
Oxytocin and other things, which are trust molecules, which are, women typically have the highest levels of oxytocin during, ovulation and during childbirth. And so I don't know of any great data on that effect. But the feeling that you're describing, which is that there's just something wrong, there's just something different, that's common. I mean, and normally we describe that in terms of their facial responsiveness and their eyes. And so, for example, I've struggled, I think, like we are in this conversation, to describe what it's like to see psychopathic eyes.
Yes.
And one of the reasons why we put eyes on the cover of my book was because they're so salient in this regard. And the best way to describe it, I think, is that they have no warmth.
No.
That psychopathic eyes are cold, and they don't show any warmth when they start talking about things that are normally most of us would find emotional. And it's that lack of emotional warmth and connectivity that is extremely salient when you're interacting and talking to them.
Right.
It's kind of like a lizard.
Yeah, I mean, it's shark. People have described them, snake, those types of eyes that just don't have a lot of limbic control. It's funny because snakes and sharks don't have a very strong limbic system of the brain, which is what we know is abnormal in psychopaths. And so it's very much like an analogy to those types of those eyes.
Well, and it's obvious too. Like when you are communicating with them, if you didn't have any education or knowledge on psychopathy, you would just, because I know I was going, what is this? Like, it's like hitting a wall, kind of. There's no, when you're just looking into someone's face, like people would describe it as, seeing their soul or something on the inside. It's just
Nothing
a wall
there.
of.
Wow.
You're absolutely right. There's just a flatness in the entire presentation, but largely around affective things. They can get excited and all of those other types of things and describe hedonistic-like activities very well, but they'll always equate things like, they'll always say, you'll ask them, have you ever been in love? And they'll refer to their best sexual encounter. Right. And they won't have any sense of what love really means. They can't describe it. They can't understand the feelings. They can't present with those feelings. When you ask them about their relationships with their parents and stuff, they just, they probably haven't talked to them in 15 years, or they say that they talk to them they say that they have a close relationship, they love their parents, but then when you ask their mom, like, I haven't heard from them in like 15 years. And that's big red flag. I mean, that's like,
Where were you 5 years ago? I'm just kidding.
Yeah, where were you 5 years ago? That's right.
One thing that, in my process of discovering this person in my life that I believe is a psychopath, I started recording conversations, and not to get this person in trouble. There was maybe a little criminal activity on his part, but for me,
we can edit that out.
Right? No, but for me, it was like, I don't know how to describe the way he talks because it's so abnormal, meaning his conversations and the disconnect of emotion, or unable to articulate in words anything emotional regarding the relationship. It was bizarre. So I recorded it because I wanted somebody to listen to it, because I knew it was wrong. I knew something was wrong, but what it was, I didn't know. I really wanted someone to tell me, like, okay, what is this? Because this is totally not normal.
There actually is a lot that can be learned from the analysis of the speech of individuals with these traits of psychopaths. And we have actually been about to start a project where we have thousands and thousands of hours of videos. We were going to try to do analysis, like linguistic analysis, to help identify if the ways that they use speech, the ways that they use words, the intonations, all the different ways you can analyze speech, does that help to identify individuals who are high or low traits? And so it's my experience, and I think like yours, that this is the case, that they definitely talk differently than others. So it's a question of, can we find a way of using that to help diagnose or assess or understand the condition? So that's something that we're going to try to work on.
Oh, that's fascinating, because it's clearly there's something to it. And it's also like the diversion tactics they use too. And it just goes like in a loop, in a circle. Like it just...
During their speech?
Yeah. Or during a conversation, it's so generic, but you could be talking about, if someone's dying on their deathbed, yet this person is just like in this robotic, like circular conversation that goes nowhere.
Exactly right. I mean, that's exactly right. And there's actually terms that we use too, that, circumstantiality, it's called, where the conversation doesn't go anywhere, never comes back and completes something.
Right.
There are ways of breaking down language along these types of dimensions. It hasn't really been applied. Those techniques haven't really been applied to understand psychopathy yet. That's something I think there's a lot of value in doing that.
That's bizarre.
Yeah.
How about body language? Anything there on body language? Do they show anything common?
There's a couple of papers that have been published that psychopaths use more hand gestures. That is,
As I'm doing this.
those gestures actually disconnected. They're disconnected from what they're saying. So they might be talking about something, and you're like, people are kind of overwhelmed by the body motion, just like the amount of information they're giving you. Mm-hmm. And you kind of leave like, what did I just learn, or what just happened? And you tend to interpret them as in a positive way, but often you realize that they didn't really tell you anything of significance or value. And it just is the way they present. It's kind of jovial, or well, I'm looking for a word here.
A show?
Sarcastic. Yeah. But what's been published is that they have a disconnection. They use more of those hand gestures. They don't use them at the appropriate times, and they're a little different. Yeah. So that's
really bizarre.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of us use gestures that, to talk about things, but psychopaths are kind of just more disconnected when it comes to that. They're just more likely to use hand gestures, flamboyance almost, if you will.
Yeah, a show, like a presentation, like they're on stage.
But there's nothing there.
Right. I've observed the craziest, like, this person in my life was like a social climber to a degree that it was embarrassing. Like, I wouldn't want to be there, because I'm thinking, do you not think that all these people don't know what you're doing?
You might want to tell them that story where you go into you went into a room and you had people there, and he went and targeted the biggest name in the group.
It's like the most premeditated targeting of money, power, celebrity, that it's like embarrassing.
Do they do that?
They're classic. One of the classic things that we refer to as social disinhibition. And so they're completely disinhibited. They'll go talk to anyone, anything. And they have no fear whatsoever, or apprehension, or even a modicum of if you will, of like appreciation for, people's boundaries and other things. And so they're just completely disinhibited that way.
Right.
And that's one of the things that's really interesting about the condition, is that social disinhibition.
Well, and also, like, I observed this person talking to, like, let's say he's talking to you and you're a professional. He's now coaching you on your job.
Oh, there'll be an expert in everything.
Oh gosh, it's like what?
No, they'll tell stories like they're like the world's expert on directing, to use one of your and find out, well, what have you directed? I've never directed anything, but I'm and then the next thing you know, you're like, you could check it and you can find out like they've never even done anything, or they'll say they're a producer, or they'll say something like that. And then when you actually really ask them what they've done, they just have no idea what they're talking about.
Right.
But people don't usually probe like that. People don't usually question like that. And so they come off with like, well, I just met this nice guy who does this, this, and this, and maybe you should go talk to him. And now that's like a reference now that's relevant to them. And so, no, that's a very classic thing. But careful checking always can illuminate that that's fraudulent, or that it's fake. And it's sometimes very fun to mess with them when they're interviewing them in a forensic context, because, I had one guy who said, we were talking about summer jobs or whatever, and he said that he had worked in Alaska and made a lot of money fishing, doing the cannery stuff and fishing. He made like $15,000 one summer. And then I came back to it a few minutes later and I said, well, what summer was that you were up there doing that? And he goes, oh, it was like, 2001. And I said, but you were incarcerated from 1999 to 2004. So when was the summer? Oh, I guess it was, I got the year wrong. It was 1997. Oh, so you did this when you were 16? And then he's like, I just don't really remember.
Right,
And then
right.
Only Dr. Kiehl would mess around with a psychopath. More power to you. Quick question on this. TV, superheroes, sometimes they seem to grab some of these traits, and we as a society seem to enjoy it. And I'm kind of thinking of Batman here. We've had a couple of professors who wrote books on the psychology of Batman, and I never really approached this question. I should have. If I can approach you with it, I guess, is some of those traits seem to be psychopathic with Batman.
I'd have to think about that for a second. But the Batman persona, trying to do good but doing it in a dark way. The Batmans that I don't know usually, gratuitously kill. They just kind of disable and then leave them for the police to arrest. And so that's not psychopathic. The need some of the traits. I mean, Batman, I don't remember him ever being promiscuous like James Bond or something like that. I don't ever remember that, So I don't think I would describe Batman-related traits as very psychopathic, especially given the motivations and the history, the parents being killed and the motivations of trying to make those types of changes. But it's more the other guys that he's catching that are more psychopathic, the Joker and those types of guys. They're
What
more
about the fascination with, like, Dexter?
So I find it absolutely fascinating as well, the public's interest in these things. And I think it really stems from, it's about as foreign as anything that you're going to run into in your life. It's just like, in New Mexico, we like to talk about aliens, right? So that that's about as foreign as anything that you could think about. And aliens are extremely popular in the media too. And serial killers and psychopaths we just don't understand it. We just can't understand how someone could do something like that. And so then you can write great stories because it's just so completely different from the normal human experience. And I think that is something that generates curiosity and generates an interest in people. Is just how someone could be like that.
I have a question. This is a problem I came up against. When I felt like I had figured out kind of what I was dealing with, I had to deal with law enforcement, etc. And I found myself not wanting to describe this person as a psychopath because of their perception of what a psychopath is. They wouldn't believe you. Like, I'm solely talking about Ted Bundy here. Like, they go to that extreme and kind of they
Didn't believe you?
yeah, they don't believe you when you say, no, I'm dealing with a psychopath and I need to know if possible the level of danger I'm looking at, or they're just like, what do you mean a psychopath?
Are they just not equipped to handle that?
I don't think. I have 4 cousins who are cops, and they're very educated about psychopathy. But but generally, I would say it's not common for police to try to make individualized assessments based on a personality measure like this. Most of them are going to do it based on simply the crimes that they've committed in the past or the interactions they've had with the person in the past. And that's going to drive their and the amount of pushback they're going to get about implementing something like a restraining order or something like that. And so it's definitely a bit of a complication. However, judges are increasingly doing what's referred to as a risk assessment when issuing restraining orders and other things. Can I identify the variables that are likely to determine that this is a good thing to do? I can't tell you how many times I've seen psychopathic individuals served with a restraining order and it sets them off to go do something bad. I mean,
yes.
I tell everyone I've ever worked with, victim or whatever is in such a case like this, that the best thing they can do is be as far away from possible as anything's known to them. So if you serve them with something like that, you want to set up cameras and videotape everything outside your house because they will show up.
That's right.
And do something, and that's a violation. But you should be out of this state.
Yes.
When such things happen, because that is a big trigger point to them. It's a loss of control. It feeds into their need for to manipulate the situations, etc. So that is a very common thing to do.
I opted not to get a restraining order for that reason, and it was just purely instinctual. Like, I knew if I were to embarrass this person because he's a public figure on a public platform, that would be it. That would, because there's no boundaries, so why would he adhere to any boundary?
You're absolutely right.
That's too dangerous to do any other ones.
Probably
Right?
How would you do you ever take into consideration like narcissism with psychopathy, or are they all narcissists? Or
It's a good question. Narcissists are usually individuals who have a huge ego and just they're very glib, and it overlaps a bit with the psychopathic traits. But narcissists are usually not impulsive. They don't have the hot-headedness and other types of things. So they're just kind of very egocentric, and that can often lead to problems for them, which can then end up with pathological problems like can't keep a job and that kind of stuff. But narcissists are just a little bit different. They're not usually as dangerous. They're not usually going to be violent. It doesn't predict violence, for example. Whereas psychopathy and the other traits, the emotional core traits, the lack of empathy, guilt, and remorse, those are very predictive of violence, future violence.
can one have both?
Yeah, I have met a few people who have that. So those called comorbidity, where you would have overlapping, traits. Usually, I'm working with individuals who have what we refer to as like sadistic traits and psychopathic traits, but narcissistic traits can fall into a circumplex of individuals. I tend to find that that's more rare, at least in prisons, but it might be the case that psychopaths in the community might have higher level of narcissistic traits than we do in the prison samples I work with.
Sure, that would make sense too.
We have a few minutes left. I don't know if you have anything else you want to ask him. I was just going to ask him what.
Yeah, go ahead.
How do we prepare ourselves? What was the recommendation you would give somebody who finds himself maybe in a similar situation? You go, this isn't right. What should they do? Just leave?
That's not bad advice. My general recommendation has been to extricate yourself from the situation as easily, as quickly as possible, because it's not likely to end well. And so the easier you can remove yourself from the situation, the better. My general recommendations are to arm yourself with some knowledge so that you're armed with information so that you can recognize high-risk traits. You can recognize individuals who are likely to be, have psychopathic traits. And so in that context, there's a couple chapters in my book that try to summarize those things as accurately as you can. There are, of course, lots of other books that do a good job of this as well. And so that would be what I would suggest, is to arm yourself with some information about how to recognize these traits, and then how to take your time to make sure that your first read was correct, and in which case you might leave, or in the other case it might be that the person doesn't have those high risk traits. So that's what I would try to do, is just educate yourself.
And one quick last question for the people watching. How common is a psychopath in your environment, your society? Let's say someone's at college. What are the roundabout percentages that you are going to interact with a psychopath at some point?
So the epidemiological data says that it's about 1 in 150 men will meet the clinical threshold that we would refer to them as having psychopathy.
Okay.
And I think that but remember, most psychopaths don't typically make it to college, and that's just because they're they quit school early because they don't like to stick to anything. But if you're in a college environment or something like that, it might be maybe 1 in 250, 300. But that's the clinical level. It's still the case that someone might have moderate levels of these traits that could be very problematic, but doesn't necessarily manifest all of them to the highest levels. And so there, I just again think it's valuable to review the traits, understand how they're assessed, and then to affiliate with individuals who are much less psychopathic. You'll be much happier.
Yes, that's true.
Thank you so much again, Dr. Kiehl. That was fabulous.
Yeah.
I cannot imagine exploring the world of psychopaths like you did, but we definitely appreciate the work you're doing. Thank you very much, Kelly, once again for joining us.
Thank you for
She's a fabulous co-host, or what? Once again, Dr. Kiehl, Professor of Psychology and Neuroscience at the University of New Mexico. Here's his great book, Psychopath Whisper. You have to get it. I read it. It's absolutely fabulous. Remember, our motto is simple. Wherever there's psychology involved, we are there. We'll see you next time, everyone.